I had written a book about politics and the occult that came out 10 years ago, 2008, and it was called, funnily enough, Politics and the Occult. And things are rather different on the political scene then. And the sort of main idea for that book was that I wanted to show that, sort of contrary to popular belief, insofar that there was one, any relationship between politics and the occult didn't necessarily have to take place on the right side of the political spectrum. That's sort of the idea that had been promoted by people like Umberto Eco. And there was a whole other sort of pop genre of books about Nazis and the occult and things of that sort. And I wasn't saying that there was nothing like that. And it wasn't so much that I wanted to exonerate occultism from any taint of being associated with far-right politics. I mean, it's there. It's just undeniable. Some of the people that, quite a few of the people that are sold in this shop would fall under that category. But it wasn't only that. And that if you look for it, there was a kind of progressive occult politics. And some of the people I pointed to were people like Blavatsky, who was involved with the founding of this shop, I think, some time ago. As I was saying, one of the people I was talking about who you could consider be associated with a kind of progressive occult politics was Madame Blavatsky, who, as I tried to say in my book about her, was more of a free-thinking humanist than anything else. She was a very progressive thinker. She was involved with what you would call sort of feminism today. It wasn't even suffragettism at that point. I'm always plagued by members of the Black Brotherhood. They come in at odd moments and interrupt my talk. Everyone I ever had. So I'm sorry, that's a joke. So I was saying, Madame Blavatsky we can consider an example of a kind of progressive occultism. And it even goes back as far as the Rosicrucians in the early 17th century, who formed kind of the occult wing of the Protestant Revolution. That was the aim of that book. But Dark Star Rising is something different. It is about occultism in far-right politics, or taking place on the far-right spectrum of the political scene. And it isn't about something in the past. It's happening today, as we speak, right now. Forces of darkness are out there in the... Oh, sorry, stop that. But no, as we speak, it's actually happening out there in the world in different forms. And how I became aware of this was through a series of strange kind of coincidences and things linking up of that sort. The main one was that if you recall, very soon after the U.S. presidential election in 2016, when Trump won, it's about a week or so, a little bit more, maybe less than that afterwards, there was the annual meeting of a group known as the National Policy Institute, or the NPI. And that is a rather innocuous name for a group that many people believe to be basically sort of white nationalists or white supremacists, certainly on the far right side of the spectrum. And I've heard recently that actually there was a group called the Southern Law Center that was sort of after them, and I think they've had some success in doing something. So, any case, but right after Trump's election, the NPI had their annual meeting, and they had it in the Ronald Reagan building. And the leader, or the head of the NPI then, was Richard Spencer. And Richard Spencer, you may know, is also the fellow who invented the alternative right, the alt-right, or at least he claims credit for creating the alt-right. If you don't know what the alt-right is, this is kind of new, right-wing, far-right kind of counterculture, let's say, in the United States, that differentiates itself from earlier kind of far-right white supremacist groups that are more sort of skinheady and kind of redneck. They have more of an intellectual wing, they're into certain ideas, there's certain thinkers that they base their work on. So they're a bit more sophisticated. And they're certainly hip to what's happening today because they use the internet and all that kind of thing. And there was quite a flurry of interest in them just around the election and just after that. And they were even turning up in magazines like GQ. And they were very well appointed and well dressed. And it was sort of like the new hip conservative look or something like that. They were the new hip, ultra-conservative hipsters or something. But in any case, what had happened at this meeting is that Spencer started it off by addressing a crowd, about maybe 3 or 4 times the size of this one, and saying, "Hail Trump, hail our hero, hail our victory. We made this happen. We willed this into being. We made this dream our reality." And they called it their victory of the will. Now, if that wasn't enough to give sort of a hint about sort of the sensibilities happening there, the response to this declaration was a series of sort of, Nazi salutes, or Roman ones, as Richard Spencer later explained. And this got sort of in all the newspapers, or the online equivalent of this was all over the web. It wasn't sort of on just weird fringe, websites. This was on everything, even CNN. And but what got most attention, as you probably suspect, was all the Nazi salute kind of stuff, and sort of references to sort of victory of the will, which was sort of Hitler kind of phrase. And but what someone picked up amidst all the other sort of reports of this was a fellow named Harv Bishop, who's actually in the room here, and he's a New Thought blogger. And you probably know what New Thought is. It's a generic name for a variety of different sort of philosophies that mental science, science of mind, positive thinking, things of that sort. I mean, the basic idea is that thoughts are causative. Thoughts are things. By thinking intently and vividly and persistently enough and focusing very, very determinedly on your aims and goals, you can make things happen. Thoughts can make things happen. Okay. And I don't know, about 10 years or so ago, Rhoda Burns had a big hit with, she sort of repackaged the whole thing and sold a very well-known secret to lots of people. But what our bishop noticed was that, well, what Spencer seems to be saying is that he's using New Thought to put Trump into office. Because that's the whole idea of New Thought, is to make dreams reality. To use your will to make reality happen. Okay, so that's one thing that sort of is the beginning of this kind of sort of puzzle. Now, if that was all it was, that would have been a strange, a little bit to the news and all that these days. Would have been entertaining. But, it would have sort of fluttered by, and we wouldn't hardly have noticed it. But strange thing is that Trump himself is a devotee of New Thought. He's a devotee of the branch of it known as positive thinking. Positive thinking is a phrase that was popularized by the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale. In 1952, he published the book Power of Positive Thinking. It must have worked because it stayed on the New York Times, top of the bestseller list for about 2 years. It was an immense bestseller. Peale already had a career on the radio and written some other books, and he had newspaper columns. And he was known for his sermons that he gave at the Marble Collegiate Church on 29th Street and 5th Avenue in New York. And even when I lived in New York in the mid and late 70s, I remember walking, past the church, and there was the sort of the sort of signboard outside for Peale's lectures and all that. And there was a whole sort of therapeutic center in the building as well. But Trump's family went to those sermons, and Trump himself had 2 of his weddings in the church. Peale presided over one, and Peale's successor presided over the other one. And Trump grew up in this atmosphere of this notion of positive thinking. And Peale expressed things in this very sort of nice, healthy, robust Christian rhetoric. And he was very forward-thinking, and he was very affirmative and gung-ho, and you can do it and all that. Just do it today, like Nike tells us now, all that kind of thing. He was, just do it then, in his own kind of context. But the background to his ideas come out of this philosophy known as New Thought. And it mostly comes out of people writing in the early 20th century, like Ernest Holmes, or Ralph Waldo Trine. Napoleon Hill had a book called Think and Grow Rich, another one that must have worked because it did for him. He made a lot of money out of that book. And even goes back to people like Mary Baker Eddy and a woman named Emma Curtis, who was a student of Mary Baker Eddy's, but then she left because she became very much more involved in kind of the more occult side of it. The most remarkable people from that time is a fellow named William Walker Atkinson, who was a veritable one-man army of New Thought writers. He had something called Yogi Publications that came out of Chicago. He wrote a series of books. He was Yogi Ramacharaka, and he was the Master Incognito, and he was a few other characters as well. So there's a lot of this stuff, floating around, and basically it was kind of self-helpy. Fundamentally, was appealing to people who felt life didn't treat them that well, and they should be getting more out of it. And if they could use the power of the mind somehow to do this. But I mean, that sounds very cheesy, and it sounds very easy to ridicule. And of course, all this stuff has been. At the same time, the fundamental ideas go back to a bit more substantial people, like Ralph Waldo Emerson. Who, the phrase "New Thought" comes from him, from one of his essays, and the philosopher and psychologist William James, who actually practiced what was known as mind cure methods in the early 20th century to cure himself of a variety of sort of nervous disorders and problems he had. And he even lobbied successfully to prevent legislation that would have limited the access to this kind of material to people. So there's very well-known, intelligent, influential people in history that have taken this stuff seriously. So there's something there. But then Trump, grew up in this. And if you ever have a chance to read any of his own self-help books, like The Art of the Deal, they're saturated with positive thinking as well. They're saturated with the same ideas. And you can see it in his own kind of way he carries himself, the way he operates. One of the fundamental ideas that he got from Peale was that facts don't matter. It's your attitude toward the facts that matter. And this goes back to the Greek philosopher Epictetus, who said it's not things that bother us, it's our ideas about things. So again, there's a certain, pedigree, there's a certain kind of intellectually solvent heritage with this kind of stuff, which means that, it's not just completely rubbish that we can just discard. So you've got sort of Trump fellow travelers using New Thought in some way to help put him in office. And you've got Trump himself, who grew up in a whole atmosphere of New Thought, positive thinking, and that kind of thing. So those are two things right there. Okay, now, how did they put Trump into office? What did they actually do? This is the strange part, so I'm going to have to ask, if you'd be a bit patient, and to suspend your disbelief perhaps for a few moments. They apparently did it through something that's known as chaos magic, and I'm sure there's quite a few books about some chaos magic in the shop. But for those who aren't that familiar with it, the chaos magic is basically a kind of DIY, do-it-yourself kind of magic. And it kind of came up around the same time as punk did, and in sort of the same area too, apparently out in Deptford, out there, places like that, in the early 70s. I think it was 76, there's something called the Deptford Olympic Goat Roast. That was supposed to be some actual chaos magic event that the Stoke Newington magicians were involved with there. This was kind of the beginning of chaos magic. And fundamentally, chaos magic is basically, instead of sticking to all the old, impedimenta, the sword, the wand, the circle, all the demons, all the, getting it all right, neurotically, right, make it up. Use whatever you have at hand. You could say it's the equivalent, magical equivalent of sort of found art. Objet trouvé. You pick something up in the street, you take it home, you put a frame over it, and suddenly it's art. And you can convince enough people it's not only at home, it's in the National Gallery or somewhere else. So the equivalent of that is, in magical terms, what they're doing in chaos magic. And when it first started happening, the kind of bits and pieces of things they used was a lot of stuff in popular culture. This is one of the kind of characteristics of chaos magic, that it appropriates lots of stuff from popular culture. It's a postmodern form of magic, in the sense that it shares the postmodern sensibility of things being broken up and fractured in bits and pieces, and you can kind of take them, they're all kind of velcroed to each other, and you can take them off and put them together in different ways, a kind of Lego block approach to things. So chaos magic appreciates that kind of thing too, making things up, picking things from different places, putting them together. I mean, I would say, if you've ever seen the British Library, I think the architect must have been a chaos magician. This kind of weird kind of things is kind of smashed onto each other that make no sense at all, I think. So in any case, that's mine. That just came to me. So any case. But at the time when this was happening, this is the late 70s, early 80s, the kind of bits and pieces were old school stuff. Stuff from television, or movies, or books, and magazines, things like that. But by the time of the 2000s and the time we're talking about, the things at hand weren't stuff like that. They were what is known as internet memes. Okay? And I'm sure you'll know what a meme is. It's a phrase coined by Richard Dawkins. It's the kind of cultural equivalent of a gene. So a meme is basically, it's anything that gets picked up in the culture and kind of, dispersed and disseminated and imitated, mimetic, it's copied, that kind of thing. And sometimes memes, it's kind of like Chinese whispers or telephone. They start out one way, and by the end of the kind of series, it's very, very different. And that kind of happened to the main meme in question, which I'll get to in a moment. But the idea was that somehow you could use, rather than using bits and pieces of things, books and umbrellas and glasses as in a magical ceremony, you use stuff on the internet. And this strikes me as, as very likely, because I think we can think of the internet as a kind of exteriorized imagination. The internet is a kind of exteriorized collective consciousness, I would say. I think we can think of it that way. And everyone was talking about the noosphere and all that kind of thing. When it first was happening, it was, global and everything. Suddenly everyone in the world suddenly became a lot more intelligent and conscious and was really concerned with a lot of serious things because they could talk to each other across the planet. Of course, we know it wasn't quite like that. But still, that was the idea. All right. So this isn't a strange idea. So I think it isn't too strange an idea to suggest that the internet is this kind of exteriorized imagination. And as part of this, we've been doing this for a while. Television, a variety of different ways. And the funny thing about all that kind of thing is that the simulated reality, the exteriorized reality, we ask it to be more and more real. HD, 3D, variety of other things, virtual reality. So this simulated reality, we press it and press it and press it to be even more real. And I would say we tend to pay less and less attention to the really real reality. You with me? Okay, good. What happened is that these online addicts on 4chan, this kind of cyber subculture, these really frustrated and disinherited and disaffected youths who describe themselves as living in their parents' basement. I mean, they say that themselves. Got addicted to sort of posting stuff, and they posted on this site called 4chan mainly because it's anonymous. You can post whatever you want, and nobody's going to hold you to account because, it's anonymous. In fact, the whole anonymous, with the V for Vendetta mask, they came out of that. They came out of 4chan. That emerged from that. That's one of the sort of cultural phenomena that emerged from this sort of thing. I can't go into that, but I do talk about it in the book. And one of the things they got into posting about was this film, The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman film from some years ago. And they had this thread called Bane posting. And they were fascinated with Bane, the bad guy. And the beginning of the film is what they posted a lot about. And so, if you know the beginning of the film, Bane's on a plane, he's ostensibly being taken, to prison or something like that. But actually, he's in control, he's in charge, he takes over, and he sends the plane crashing. And for some reason, they really like that. They got their kicks, as it were, and I'll get onto that in a bit, by watching this kind of thing. And what they noticed, or some of the people noticed, is that there seemed to be strange echoes, coincidences between this scene that kept posting and the tragic Germanwings 9525 crash. I think it was 2015 in the Alps. And one of the things was the crash site was near a town or village called Bane. And one of the crash site investigators' name was Bruce Robin. Bruce Wayne, Robin's a sidekick. Okay. And the other thing was that, as in the film, apparently the plane was crashed on purpose. The pilot crashed it. And something else that sort of echoed with this was a little bit further on, was actually when Trump was elected, or during the, I think it was after he was elected, there was a speech he gave. He talked about, giving power back to the people. And there's a scene in the film where Bane is doing that. He's taken over Gotham and he confronts the city there and he says, "I'm giving power back to you, the people." So, again, these strange kind of coincidences are hovering around. Led them to think that, well, somehow what they were doing on the net was affecting reality. Things happening on the net were bleeding off the net into the real world and making things happen. A similar phenomenon was the Slender Man thing. If you remember that, I can't go into that, but that's another kind of thing. There's a whole kind of Slender Man thing. And he got off the net and into the real world, and there were dire consequences. Okay, so this got christened Synchro Mysticism. Now, Synchro Mysticism is really just a online, cyber retread of Jung's synchronicity. But instead of the synchronicity happening between my inner world, or your inner world, and the outer world, it happens between what's on the net and the outer world. It happens between this exteriorized imagination and the outer world. Right? That's the theory behind it. So, and given that I accept the reality of synchronicities, I've experienced enough myself, I've read enough about them, I accept them as things that happen in the world. I have no idea why they happen or how they happen, and I'm not convinced by any explanation of them. But I'm convinced that they exist. And so I don't categorically reject the idea that this could possibly happen. Because what's a synchronicity is fundamentally something happening in the outer world that correlates meaningfully, immediately, indubitably with something going on inside yourself. And I would say magic is fundamentally induced synchronicities. Magic would be if you can make the synchronicity happen. And that's what chaos magic tries to do. But it's also what New Thought tries to do. And one of the things that helped to cement this kind of, little synchronistic kind of puzzle I was putting together was the idea that both chaos magic and New Thought are results driven. They both want to make things happen. Chaos magic came up because they were tired of getting in touch with their holy guardian angel. They weren't interested in that spiritual side of magic. They weren't interested in the Golden Dawn kind of magic. That was old hippie stuff. Just like the Pink Floyd were old hippie stuff for Johnny Rotten and the Sex Pistols. They wanted to make that guy fall down. Or, make money come in the mail tomorrow. Stuff like that. They weren't interested in the spiritual side of it. It was results driven. It's very practical. It's utilitarian. It's functional. And New Thought is that as well. It's all about making something happen, having a real effect on the world. So this thing started to come together. So an offshoot of chaos magic, known as meme magic, was being employed by people on the far right to help put Trump into office. All right? Trump himself is a follower and a practitioner of New Thought. Okay. And I've talked to you about chaos magic. Now, what's one word you would say that comes to mind when you think about Trump?
Twitter.
I would say chaos. I would say chaos myself. I mean, I'm sure there's a few others. But I would say chaos myself. And I would say he's very good at spreading it around. And he likes to have it. And if you've read any of his books, he talks about, I like to keep everybody on their toes. I don't like to inform everybody what I'm going to do. I change my mind often. I like to keep things open and loose and all that kind of thing. So that's a very fundamental kind of chaos magic sensibility. The whole idea is that you can accept positions and use them and take, like clothes. You can take on a belief and discard it when you don't need it anymore. You can say one thing over there and say something completely different over there, which Trump does all the time. This whole idea that reality is malleable. Reality is open to be directed and molded and shifted and turned and nudged. That's the chaos magic word. You nudge it in the direction you want it to go. And another thing that chaos magic and New Thought and positive thinking come together on is that, in a way, what you want to make happen should be something that you could do any other way. But you somehow, you aren't able to do it in the normal way, and it needs to happen in this other paranormal way. So, in a way, you can't expect a miracle. That's the funny side of it. It's sort of like, it's like what you want to happen has to be, a realizable wish. Or that's the New Thought phrase. The Chaos Magic phrase is an achievable reality. Now, the language is slightly different, but I would say they're talking about the same kind of thing. So again, all these things kind of come together. Okay, so that's kind of that part of it. Now, the other strange thing that happened after Trump got elected was in February 2017, the New York Times published an article about a speech that Steve Bannon, at the time still on Trump's bench, still with an ear to the great man, had given to a select group of very conservative churchmen in the Vatican. There's a group called the Human Dignity Institute. Now the talk actually took place in 2014, and Bannon was in Los Angeles, and through the miracle of Skype, he was talking to these people in the Vatican. But the interesting thing about the New York Times article was that they singled out one thing to highlight about this talk. And the thing they singled out was that in the midst of all the kind of usual rhetoric, Bannon's rhetoric about the global Tea Party movement and fighting Islamic fascism and a variety of other sorts of things, was that he name-dropped a fellow named Julius Evola. Now you know who Julius Evola is. Julius Evelyn, who he was. He was a 20th century esoteric philosopher. He belonged to the school known as Traditionalism, which was established by the French scholar and savant Rene Schwaller in the 1920s, I believe. And but along with being very brilliant and incisive esoteric scholar and thinker, Evola also had a taste for far-right politics. He tried to ingratiate himself first with Mussolini, and then with National Socialists. He had some success with Mussolini, but he eventually gave up on Mussolini's fascists because he didn't think the Italians were good enough material. Mussolini's fascism wasn't fascist enough for Evola. He had this vision of an absolute fascism that went back to a kind of theocratic, organic, spiritual civilization. This is kind of the whole sort of idea of traditionalism. The modern world is just completely gone rotten and has fallen away from the ancient values, the traditional values and things of that sort. But along with that, so Bannon mentions him. Okay, so that to me is strange enough, that someone who's kind of coaching the new president of the United States reads a far-right Italian esotericist who tried to get in good with both Hitler and Mussolini. And after the war, he was kind of like the gray eminence behind these new far-right groups sprouting in Italy after that. And he's also one of the intellectual heavyweights whom the alt-right refer to all the time. I mentioned earlier that they have a kind of intellectual, a kind of canon of thinkers, and one of them is Evola. And he's brilliant. He's brilliant. He's not a raving lunatic. He's very lucid. He's a very lucid thinker. I don't care for his politics, but he has some very interesting things to say, and I think they're worth hearing. But along with all that, Evola himself practiced the form of New Thought. And he, too, in the 1920s, tried to influence events around him, just as the alt-right and Richard Spencer are supposed to have done, too. One of the things he wanted to do was, in the 1920s, he belonged to an esoteric group called the UR, or the group, meaning primordial, like, the Pflanze, like Goethe, the primordial plant. They had a journal where they wrote under pseudonyms, variety of pseudonyms. And Evola wrote quite a few articles about precisely the whole idea of using the mind to affect reality. The same thing that New Thought people are talking about. The same thing that Donald Trump is interested in. And the same thing that the Chaos Magic people are interested in as well. And what he wanted to do in the 1920s was to imbue in Mussolini's fascists the ancient Roman virtues, the noble qualities that they had. One of which was a kind of warrior kind of quality. I don't know how well he did with the other qualities he was interested in, but the Ethiopians soon found out how warlike the Italians were. So, but what leads us into the next bit, and you can get into the questions, let me say this. Bannon name-dropped Evola in the context of referring to somebody who's in the milieu around Vladimir Putin. This fellow named Aleksandr Dugin, who's still around. He's into chaos magic. He's into a form of mental science. He's into Evola. He's had the ear of Putin and lots of other people around him. So that's kind of the context. And in the book, I tell the story of what all these sort of people are doing. But that's kind of the backdrop. And none of this is conspiracy theory. This is out in the open. This is all stuff it's on the news. This is why it struck me as very, very strange, because I've been writing about the history of sort of Western esoteric traditions for some time now. And I felt like history had caught up to me. Because suddenly all the stuff that was on the fringe, they had to go out of your way to find. It was there. It was on, CNN, and, whatever, BBC. It was there, right then and there. They're talking about it. And it's still out there. You can find different versions of it. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. So I didn't make this up. There's nothing sinister about New Thought per se itself. That's why I was emphasizing it goes back to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I mean, look at Harv Bishop. Does he look sinister right there? He's the guy who outed all this stuff, right? He's the nicest guy in the world. But I'm just saying, these things are real. These, as you say, I agree with you. It's there. It's like, as with magic, it's like, who's using it and for what ends and to what purposes. I mean, I talk about Ayn Rand in the book and actually use her as an example of a guru. And saying in the sense that, all gurus don't appeal only to the irrational. That's what we usually say. Oh, if people get caught up with the guru, it's because they're somehow weak-minded and, they're attracted to the irrational. Well, Ayn Rand, she's a rationalist through and through. And she's also into capitalism. She's Aristotle meets Andrew Carnegie.
I guess my biggest concern at this current time in history is the polarization in society.
I agree.
A lot of that has to do with the extreme demonization of Trump. Whereas my personal belief
I'm not demonizing anybody. This is just stuff. I'm a reporter here. Yeah. It's not a polemic. The book is not a polemic. And you know what? Get it and you'll find out. Buy the book and you'll find out it's not a polemic. I mean, I'm not anti-Trump. I'm just saying this stuff is just happening. It's fascinating to me because I'm interested in the occult, the mystical, and all that kind of stuff. Yes. It's fascinating to me because it's smack dab in the middle of things. My own personal thing, I personally don't think Trump should be the president of the United States, but, that's just me. There's several million people who disagree with me. So, in any case, let's move on. That gentleman had a question there. Thank you.
You used the word synchronicity, and it's sort of central to this stuff, isn't it? And Jung speaks about synchronicity as an a-causal connecting principle.
Yeah.
And do you think there's a difference between the people who see it in Jung's terms and those who see it as a way of changing the world?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Jung, what does an a-causal connecting principle mean? I mean, Arthur Kessler pointed out that actually that doesn't mean anything. It means a cause, it's not a cause.
But
so,
it's more neutral, I was thinking.
No, I agree with you. I mean, Jung would basically say it's not something that we can make happen. That's what he was trying to say. Okay, fine. Well, people disagree with him. That's all. I don't know. How else can you explain magic? Or not explain, but it strikes me that's kind of like, well, what when something that you wish and want, and then it happens, isn't that kind of seems like a synchronicity to me? I mean, I don't know. It just, and I say inducing them seems, and even the people who, were talking about this, they call it synchro mysticism and all that kind of thing. So, no, sure. I mean, Jung himself wouldn't have. But then again, synchronicities happened around Jung all the time. He scared the wits out of Freud, and in fact, Freud thought that he could make them happen. There's the famous incident in the bookcase, where Jung's visiting Freud, and they're having a conversation about the paranormal, and Freud's saying it's all tosh and all that, and Jung's getting more and more angry, and he felt like his chest was getting red, and suddenly there was a loud bang in the bookcase, and he said, here, professor, that's an example of, catalytic exteriorization phenomena, which was Jung's long-winded terminology for a poltergeist. And Freud said, no, that's rubbish. And he said, no, it isn't. There'll be another one again. And there was. So after that, and the whole story is like, the cigar dropped out of Freud's mouth and the eyebrows went up and all that kind of thing. But after that, he was afraid of Jung. So, maybe they can happen, Any case, can I have that gentleman, then you? Okay.
Yeah, Gary, I've already read the book.
Okay.
I'm a lifelong socialist. I'm interested in the occult. My main problem with the book, you talk about Trump, but I see the bigger threat. You know about this neoconservative group, the Project Flynn. I see them as the chaos, the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
Trump's bad, but the Clinton. Is there an occult side behind the other side, like the Clinton?
I have no idea. Again, it's not. Trump's the occasion for the book. It's not a polemic.
Yeah.
I'm not
I mean,
attacking Trump. It's the occasion.
yeah.
And it was because of him that it's, all this other stuff is happening.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not a supporter, but it's not a polemic. But I agree with you. There's lots of things out there, but I can't fit them all in one book.
Oh, fair enough.
I know, but no, I mean, of course. This lady here has been waiting very patiently.
Something I've noticed about Trump is that he seems to deliberately or accidentally create a lot of emotional reaction in lots of people.
Yeah.
So people
Yeah.
hate him and people love him.
Yeah.
But I feel like he's feeding on it.
Yeah,
It
well,
appears to
demagogues
me
tend to do that kind of
that
thing.
he
so.
that he's able to actually live off that energy.
Oh,
And so I've been saying to
be,
people who really hate him, don't give him your energy because I think he's living off it. Maybe that. Do you think that's anything?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Just
look, I thought actually when he was here and there was the big protest, people just should have ignored him and not paying attention to him. But again, I don't want to turn this into what's good or what's bad about Trump. It's the broader kind of context, and there were quite a few things I didn't talk about in it. So.
I meant that more as a skill. I think he's very skillful.
Oh, I think he knows exactly what he's doing. I think he knows. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. He's a demagogue. I compare him in the book to. There's a chapter on gurus and demagogues, and I compare him in the book, and I also talk about him in the context of what the writer Colin Wilson called the right man. There's a particular kind of psychological profile of individuals who, under no way whatsoever, will they ever admit to being wrong. And they will maintain that constantly all the time. And when threatened with that, they'll become violent and I mean, it's bad enough when that happens within the small kind of context of a family. But throughout history, there's been quite a few of these characters who have got, power, like Mao and Mussolini and some of the people I talk about in the book. So it's not so much, there isn't like a big equal sign throughout the whole book. Trump is this, Hitler, it's not like that. It's like, well, there's similarities, there's resonances. What do you think about that? But it's more like, let's look at this bigger picture, and they seem to be kinds of things. One of the things I do talk about, which I haven't mentioned here, is this notion of the war of all against all, because I think that's what's really been happening. You talk about the divisiveness. I think we're at a stage where everybody's kind of competing with everybody else. Even like just on social media for likes. Everybody's trying to get more likes than everybody else and kind of like that. And so that's another, part of this context. So there's other ramifications that are like the backdrop to what's going on. And I didn't even get to talk about the Keck phenomena, but let's see. That gentleman in the back, then we'll do it this way, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. So gentleman in the back?
Yeah, do you think that, like, if you look at the history of New Thought, that it lacks an inherent ethics, so that it basically lends itself to any goal, or do you detect...
Well, I mean, that's, I don't know if it's New Thought itself. I mean, human beings, do they lack an ethic, so, I mean, yeah, they do. I mean, as I said, it's a power. But I think this is being addressed today. This our bishop who's here, I said he's addressed this in some of his blog posts. Mitch Horowitz, who's written a book called One Simple Idea, which is a history of New Thought. He's addressing this kind of ethical issue in it there. Yes, because it's this kind of go ahead, don't let anything get in your way, do it kind of thing. And, of course, there can be kind of, wreckage along that way. So, yes, I agree. That's a good question. But I would say, again, it's not so much the practice or the stuff, it's whoever's doing it. So that lady there?
Last question.
Last question. Okay.
Right,
Can you guys confer and have one between the three of you? No, I'm just joking.
I have two small questions. The first one is New World Order, because it hasn't been mentioned, and I felt like it would be good to mention that.
Yeah, sure.
It's been heavily mentioned in the press and the news.
It's a wonderful phrase by H.G. Wells, who doesn't get the credit for it. Actually, lots of good ideas about it, and not the horrible thing it's become. But I agree with you. Yeah.
And the other question is 2012 was a point where it was said, it was written, that a lot of the people would come to power and they would basically cancel each other out. And sort of 4 years on, we're seeing that has come to fruition. Just like your thoughts on that.
I don't know. The 2012 thing, I wrote an article called 2013, or What to Do When the Apocalypse Doesn't Arrive. I don't know. Okay, just one last a backdrop to all of this is what I call trickle-down metaphysics. That is responsible for the post-truth alternative fact world we live in that Trump profits by and abets and helps. Trickle-down metaphysics is basically what we know as postmodernism. It goes back to the philosopher Nietzsche. In the late 1880s, Nietzsche predicted the coming of what he called nihilism. it was absolutely unavoidable. And nihilism meant that all of the truths, all the truths that were hitherto held to be absolute and objective were no longer true. We could no longer consider them true. Nietzsche wanted to overcome this with something he called the reevaluation of all values, but he never got around to actually finishing that. But from those metaphysical heights, it came down over the ages. And Nietzsche said he was telling the history of the next 2 centuries. It wasn't today, it wasn't tomorrow. It was the day after tomorrow. And that's where we are. We're in the lowlands of the day after tomorrow, where the nihilism that was up in the high altitudes has dropped down to us now. And we take it as, mother's milk. We take it as given that all truths are relative. And this is the backdrop to the kind of thing that's happening here. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming.